The Game Boy Advance is celebrated as the best handheld retro console due to its extensive library of timeless games, featuring iconic franchises like Pokemon, Zelda, and Mario. Its backwards compatibility with Game Boy and Game Boy Color titles make it a versatile device, offering access to 3 generations of gaming. The Game Boy Advance also brought classic games from other consoles to handheld form, including ports of Super Nintendo hits like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past and Super Mario World. These ports allowed players to enjoy console-quality experiences on the go, solidifying the Game Boy's legacy as a groundbreaking system. And now in 2025, the Anbernic RG34XX has arrived, and this is meant to mimic the color scheme and dimensions of the Game Boy Advance, but it can do a lot more. Let me show you. Remember, we're going to be giving away a Trim UI brick at the end of January, so to be considered, subscribe to this channel and also the litnxtchannel.com down below. They are sponsoring the giveaway. Now let's talk about some Game Boys. So what we've got here is a Game Boy Advance clone, which this is the best job of it that I've ever seen. There have been different clones online from different brands that don't really do that good of a job, but Anbernic's put together a decent hardware package here, but it does have some flaws. So let's look at the hardware and then decide if it's worth sticking around for the software. Hardware time. We have a 3.4-inch IPS panel on here at 720 by 480 resolution, which is a 3x Game Boy Advance ratio. We have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on board, in addition to a 3,500 milliamp hour battery. Then running through the face of the device, we have a D-pad that is squishy and not clicky, start and select buttons that are squishy and not clicky, and the plastic is just a hair different than the buttons on the Game Boy Advance original, A, B, and blank buttons that are squishy and not clicky, in addition to a power indicator light, the mono speaker grill, which is in the right place, and that's all we have on the front face of the device. On the left-hand side of the device, we have trigger buttons that drip down on the sides, and a spot to put your lanyard, because how else will you hold on to this thing? On the right-hand side of the device, we have nothing but grips and drips. On the bottom, we have some missed opportunities here. We have a power button that is clicky and not squishy, headphone holes, and a volume up and down rocker, not wheel. And those missed opportunities are the power button is a button, not a switch. I love the switches. I don't know why they don't ever put power switches on anything. In addition to the volume pot, this one is not a wheel. It is an up and down rocker. On the top of the device, they've gotten rid of the cartridge slot, and we have L1, L2, R1, and R2, which are all squishy and not clicky. And we have even more on the top here. Where the cartridge spot used to be, we have 2 SD card slots, one for the internal OS and one for external games. These would take up the space where your cartridge would normally go, in addition to a USB-C port and a micro HDMI port, not a macro. As you may have guessed it, the hardware in shape is awesome. I think they've designed it really well to match the original aesthetic of the Game Boy Advance. I mean, I even have it here sitting in an old stand for a Game Boy Advance, and it fits the dimensions pretty well. But the problem I have with it is the screen, man. The screen on this thing just sucks. I do not like how this thing came out. With the price point that we're getting, they could have just given us more brightness. The screen and colors are fine, and refresh rate and all that stuff, but man, the brightness is just not enough for me. Comparing it to so many other options on the market here, it misses the mark from a hardware standpoint. And if they're going and making it this big of a here's what we're doing and we're taking on Nintendo's IP, I don't know. They could have made it a complete hit for me. Now, does it nail all the other hardware bits and bobs? I think so. I think everything else other than the screen is awesome. But the screen is a big piece of this whole thing. So having a very kind of dim screen, it's not for me. It's the whole thing of, I want to be able to play my Game Boy in direct sunlight and it be fine. If it doesn't, then it's kind of the whole point is that anything on the go needs to be bright. Now, to be fair, the original Game Boy Advance with no backlight at all is right here, and it does a pretty good job of still being visible. So it might be that I'm a little bit spoiled now and know what the differences are when I'm 32 versus, 12. But the difference here is it's 2025 and you can play these Game Boy Advance games on any phone you have in your pocket. So why are you buying this type of device? Well, let's look at the software and then get into comparisons with other devices and see if you want to pick this one up or maybe something else. And for software, we're running a Linux-based operating system here with Ambernix front end on it, which I do have to say this time around actually looks pretty good. It has a bunch of tabs and you can decide where to go from there between picking your emulators or going into system settings and changing a few things. But starting out in the 8 and 16-bit eras of things, everything from the Nintendo Entertainment System all the way up to the Game Boy and Game Boy Color run fantastic on this device. Now this style of screen is more of a 4:3 aspect ratio, so stuff that is a 1:1 aspect ratio will be cropped in on the sides, but this is perfect for the next level up in power, which is the Game Boy Advance. This thing runs a 3x resolution of the Game Boy Advance, and it runs it really well. Now I do wish that they had in the settings R2 or L2 set up for fast forward and autosave, but you can go in through RetroArch and do that yourself, which I hate RetroArch and it is a pain in the butt, but you can get it done that way. Moving up the power band a little bit, we're getting to the PS1 era of things, which the PS1 is not this resolution, but in a pinch you'll be able to get PS1 games to work on here. Nothing that uses a joystick though, and that's kind of going to be the rest of the way up from here. Everything like the Nintendo 64, the PSP, stuff like that is not going to be great on this device because it only has a D-pad, so anything that needs to use a joystick really isn't going to be for this device. Now, the Nintendo DS does play on here and it does play pretty well, but the screen ratio is off. So again, I wouldn't really recommend this device for that. It's more or less a bonus that it does do that. This device for me plays Game Boy Advance games ever so fantastically for the price you can get it for. But this does bring up competition because there's a lot of other things that do this and are not solely a Game Boy Advance clone. So for power, I think this device is actually doing a pretty good job of being exactly what you need it to be. It is going to play all the way up to every retro console that you're not going to be willing to buy on eBay and mod yourself. So stuff like the Nintendo DS, the PSP, some games, and pretty much anything with a D-pad is what you're going to be looking at here. Stuff like the N64 that needs a joystick, or games that do need a joystick, or stuff like that, it's not going to be playable on here. This thing, for me, is a fantastic Game Boy Advance replacement. Now, do I wish the screen was brighter? Absolutely. But for the software, I think this thing is meant to mostly be a replacement for buying an old Game Boy Advance off of eBay, fixing it up, doing a shell swap, and a screen replacement to get to where you want it to be. This thing for around $70 is going to be way cheaper than doing all of that. So now that we know what this plays power level and what we can do with the whole device here, let's look at other options in the market and see where you'd be looking at price-wise and also device-wise. And for comparison here, we have a few different options. This is the Aya Neo Pocket Micro, which I would say is the premium offering here, coming in at around $200, but it comes in running Android and at a 4x resolution of the original Game Boy. I think this is a fantastic premium option if you're looking to play 4:3 content, have Android for other purposes, and play Game Boy Advance games at a 4x resolution. Running down the line a little bit, the one we're looking at today is the Anbernic 34XX, which is a 3 times scale at 720 by 480 of the Game Boy Advance. You already know about that one. And the Anbernic comes in around 70. Moving down a little bit more, we have the Powkiddy V10, which I like the ergonomics of, and it being a 4:3 aspect ratio gaming handheld with a 480 by 320 screen, which is a 2x resolution of the original Game Boy, and I think actually looks pretty good, and it helps that it's a lot brighter. Now, speaking of brightness, the original Game Boy here, with no backlight but still at LCD, is 240 by 160 pixels. And a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is exactly what I've been trying to say this whole time, I guess. The Powkiddy came in at around $40, and to find a broken or destroyed Game Boy on eBay is anywhere between $50 and $100. if you're willing to get one that still has good PCB, but you might have to change the speakers or button pads out, it's not actually that hard to get, but you're going to have to get the shell, replacement buttons, replacement membranes, and do all the tinkering yourself, which actually may be a fun project for you. But if you're not, I think one of these options that we just went over is more or less up your speed. So, what do I think overall of the RG34XX? Well, I think Anbernic knocked it out of the park with making it look and feel like an original Game Boy Advance. I think they did that, and they didn't really need to do much else. They already had the software and chipset package that they've been packaging with the RG34XX, SP, all that kind of stuff is already made. So they just put it into a different shell, slapped a different screen on it, and away we go. So I think their software has actually gotten better over the years and is now to a point where I wouldn't really change this software out for anything else. The standby function works great. You can plug it into pretty much any charger and it works fine versus previous models. And it feels right when you're playing it. Previous iterations of Anbernic devices felt kind of chintzy, and this one feels like a Game Boy Advance replacement. So I think overall they've done a good job. I think most people will be very happy with this. It is not bright enough in the screen department, but if you're interested, there's a ton of other videos on the devices I was looking at in the comparison section and the other SP device, which I highly recommend because it's the SP. It's just the better version of the Game Boy Advance, but controls on this I do think are better. But it's up to you guys. Take a look at either of these videos, and don't forget to subscribe to be considered for the giveaway. That's all we got for today. I'll talk to you guys later. Davey out.